Welcome to episode 146 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at Epicureanfriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We're now in the middle of a series of podcasts intended to provide a general overview of Epicurean philosophy based on the organizational structure employed by Norman DeWitt in his book Epicurus and His Philosophy. This week we take a look at the three major divisions of Epicurean philosophy. Now let's join the discussion. Last week we started our discussion of general aspects of Epicurean philosophy by introducing some basic points that Norman DeWitt was stressing about the way we should have a proper understanding of where Epicurus fits in the world of Greek philosophy and what Epicurus was trying to do. And today we're going to extend that outline view from last week and get into a little bit more detail about what is it that remains from the Epicurean writings of the ancient world. And once you go looking for an understanding of Epicurean philosophy, where do you start? How do you begin the analysis? How do you begin to break things down into categories, which we'll then fill in over time with additional details? As it's recorded in Diogenes Laertius, Epicurean philosophy is broken down basically into three distinct sections. The first is the physics, the nature of the universe as a whole, examinations of basically the way things are and humanity's place in that universe as well, the place of the earth in the universe, the place of humanity on earth, and the general issues of how things work from a natural basis as opposed to a supernatural basis. A second division is canonics. The word that's often used to describe that is epistemology, which is sort of the science of how you know anything at all, the science of how do you process evidence, how do you gather evidence, how do you form opinions on the evidence that you gather, and is it possible to come to conclusions that you can have confidence in, or is knowledge impossible, as some people argue? And then the third general division is ethics, which is basically the question of how you should live after you understand the nature of the universe through the physics and the way that you think about things through the canonics. So there are those three general categories which are represented to us today in a number of letters and other documents that are primarily preserved by Diogenes Laertius. But there's also other documents, including the inscription of Diogenes of Oinoander and also, very importantly, the poem of Lucretius on the nature of things. Of course, we're organizing our presentation of Epicurean philosophy according to the commentary of Norman DeWitt, and we've talked about why that particular book is a good place to start. But students who are serious about Epicurus are going to want to read the original text as quickly as they can. In my case, I think the first thing that I read was Lucretius's poem. I didn't really even know who Diogenes Laertius was when I started out. And Lucretius's poem is one of the major ways that Epicurean philosophy was transmitted to the modern world. So let's talk about that. Joshua, where did you start when you first started reading Epicurus?
I think probably what I started with when I started reading about Epicurean philosophy was a book by Stephen Greenblatt called The Swerve. And from there, I think I probably went more or less straight into the Stallings translation of Lucretius, and then going more so through the principal doctrines and the Vatican sayings. It actually took me quite a while to get into the letters, really.
So that's interesting. So then, just like me, you started with Lucretius. Martin, where did you start, and what do you think is the best place to start?
I started with Epicurus' extant text and was looking for something entirely different. And that lead got me to buy the book with this extant text, and that's how I got into it.
Now, when you say that, Martin, are you referring to the Cyril Bailey collection of the extant text of Epicurus, or are you referring to the Epicurus Reader, which many people come across?
No, I bought a book here in the German translation from a guy, funny name, Krautz. So he wrote this German translation, but I saw it's very similar to the one from Bailey. So there are some differences, but it seems he has consulted Bailey's translation. So I saw a lot of his German translation is compatible with Bailey. But what I found from his comments, that he is also very sympathetic to Epicurus' philosophy, which is maybe different from Bailey. And that helped me probably to really understand it, because the raw text was a bit tough to read. I mean, it was clear enough to me that I saw part of it was really what I actually had thought by myself before without even thinking that this is a philosophy. And then I saw it worked out as a whole consistent thing by Epicurus.
Okay.
Yeah, and this path I can recommend to anyone who is okay with reading raw philosophical text. So for people who are not that familiar with it, it's a bit tough. Especially the letter of Herodotus is a difficult read for someone who is not accustomed to reading raw philosophy. But if someone is, I think it's the best way to start with Epicurus himself, because then you really get rightly into this and you're not too much affected by secondary literature, except, of course, that the translator will have influenced the translation.
So where you stand today, if somebody were wanting to get started, would you tell them to go to Diogenes Laertius and those extant remains first, or Lucretius?
No, Lucretius is definitely later. I think whatever version suitable of the extant remains of Epicurus himself, it's really the best way to start, unless you are not familiar with reading philosophical texts.
Okay, and among the four of us, probably Calasini is the most recent to reading in the Epicurean material. Calasini, do you have any thoughts as to where somebody might start if they're getting into Epicurus for the first time?
Yeah, basically I started skimming websites, reading different things on the internet, and then I came across a book, How to Be an Epicurean, The Ancient Art of Living Well by Catherine Wilson. I had found that at the library, but something about that wasn't really feeling right. And I wanted to basically go, in some sense, to the horse's mouth is the cliche. So I went then to the Principal Doctrines and the Vatican Sayings and the letter to Menocius and studied those. And somehow that worked best for me.
One more comment. DeWitt's book is, of course, recommended by me as a next step. Now, after we got into Epicurus, then the next book would be DeWitt, because that one gives really the best entry.
There are several, and there are different places that you can start, but going to the actual text in Diogenes Laertius is really something people are going to want to do. It's a shame for most of us that the most well-known compilation, I think, of Epicurean material is by Hermann Usner. But of course, unfortunately for most of us, except for Martin, I think that's in German, or at least in the original languages of Greek and Latin. There are English translations and versions of Usner available. Do you know if it's in German, Martin?
Oh, I've never read this one. I saw the name occasionally.
Yeah, well, the reason Usner is important is I think he was really the first person to go out there and attempt to gather all the fragments from all sorts of different sources, and not just the major ones like Diogenes Laertius, but he goes out to lots of different ancient sources and attempts to bring, as you would expect a German to do, he tries to bring a categorization model and organize them in a topical manner that I think people generally still tend to follow. You'll see references to Usner in many of the websites and other books. And his is probably, what would you call that? I guess sort of like a concordance. He made an effort to arrange things by topic from these different sources. And it's very useful because there are many isolated fragments, either by Epicurus or statements about things that he said from other writers. For example, Sextus Empiricus and Plutarch and all sorts of other ancient writers. Usner is the one who has collected the most exhaustive list and tried to put them in one place. For example, one of the sources on the internet that's really good is attalus.org, attalus.org. And Attalus uses the Usner method of classification. And another aspect, as Diogenes Laertius says, the Epicureans tended to combine the canonics, the epistemology, along with the physics. It seems to me it's fairly logical to do that. It sort of ends up making the division more like 2 than it does 3. But Lucretius and the letter to Herodotus from Epicurus tend to cover both the nature of atoms and how things come together in the universe. But it also covers what we have left of Epicurus's discussions about how to think, one of which of his opinions was this whole issue of trying to do things in outlines as a method of thinking. Anybody have any comment on why you would choose to discuss epistemology, canonics at the same time as physics?
You mentioned the letter to Herodotus, but for me, the most interesting example of this is in the letter to Pythocles, because it seems like in the letter to Pythocles, he gives a physical explanation to something, and maybe he'll give 3 or 4 physical explanations, and then he'll cite the epistemological reasons for why we think we know what is true and what is not true. And so that would be, for me, the best example of it. And the reason you would want to do it is so that in something like, for example, the size of the sun, which has become this huge controversial issue, you can not only state maybe kind of what your opinion is about the size of the sun, but also you can express the limitation of human knowledge when it comes to this issue. And so anyone who really reads that passage, I think fairly, critically, is not going to emerge with the conclusion that Cicero emerged with, which was that the sun was a foot in diameter. That's not the way that Epicurus approached the issue, was simply to lay down the fact which you must believe. That was not his method. Maybe even more important to know how you think you know what you think you know is true, rather than just thinking that it's true.
Joshua, that's a great point, because you're exactly right. That issue of the sun is in the letter to Epicurus rather than in Herodotus. And that leads to the well-known position that Epicurus took about manifold causes, that it's not so important, especially when it's not possible, to reach a conclusion that there's only one single explanation. In Epicurus, he talks about in relation to the stars in the sky and the things you see above, you have limited information. You're not able to get up there and see it close hand. And so you're basically forced, if you're going to take any positions at all, to realize that there may be more than one explanation of the rising and the setting of the sun, or eclipses, or even the size of the sun, things like that. There may be more than one logical explanation that conforms to the evidence that you do have and that does not contradict any of the evidence that you do have, but that there's not sufficient evidence to eliminate all the possibilities except one. Sometimes you can be left with several that could be true. And in those cases, that's one of the more important positions I think Epicurus takes, is that when you can't be certain that there's only one explanation of phenomena, then you don't take the position that there's only one explanation. You just don't pick one as your pet theory and ignore the rest. You honestly accept that there's multiple possibilities and you go forward based on those multiple possibilities. And that's something we'll talk about in much more detail later on as we go through the latter parts of this book. But that's a good example of how that is contained in the letter to Epicurus. The letter to Herodotus starts out with a section on the different types of philosophy, different types of knowledge. And I also remember, I think it's Lucretius book 4, where there's an extended section on illusions and on whether it's possible to have any knowledge or not. How if somebody says that nothing can be known, then you should basically disengage from further discussion with that person, because when he takes any position at all, even that nothing can be known, he's actually taking a position. And so you have to think consistently about the ideas of knowledge and what's possible and what's not possible. And probably it does make sense to combine it with physics, because physics is basically the evidence that you can see through your senses, and what that evidence is about the things around you, the atoms, the bodies, the things that change, things that don't change. And so the technology of knowledge is tightly intertwined with knowledge itself, and the technology part, and through physics, it's really hard to understand them in isolation. It appears that Epicurus wrote a separate document referenced in a term that's similar to the 12 elementary principles. So we consider today 40 principal doctrines, which are mostly about ethics, but it looks like he had a separate list of 12 fundamentals of nature, which probably were the ultimate distillation of his physical principles. That document does not exist today, but people like Diskin Clay and Norman DeWitt himself have reassembled what they think were the 12 principles based on the way the information is presented. Because you can go through the letter to Herodotus, and you can go through Lucretius, and to some extent through the fragments of Diogenes of Oinoander, and see that the major points are repeated over and over. And so one of the places you would start in getting a high-level summary of the physics would be this list of 12 elementary principles. We won't go through them right now, but that would be the highest level summary on the physics side. And I think we've had some discussion back and forth, Joshua, in the past about how many other summaries there were. DeWitt thinks that there were basically 3 levels, that the letter to Herodotus was also one of the basic documents of physics. And he thinks that there was a larger epitome, what DeWitt is referring to as a second epitome of physics, which is what Lucretius was using as the basis for his poem on the nature of things. And then after that, at the most detailed level, there was the, I think, 37 books on nature by Epicurus himself. So that whether Lucretius was working with the full 37 books when he was writing his poem, or whether there was a middle level epitome that he had in front of him. What do you guys think about that?
I can't remember who it was, but basically the conclusion that this person came to was that Lucretius was adapting the full 37 books on nature. It might have been David Sedley, now that I think about it. Anyway, that the opposite is true as well, that you could use Lucretius to sort of reconstruct an outline of the 37 books on nature. I would say probably that most of us here have no real capacity for bringing any finality to this very scholarly conversation. But those are a couple of the opinions that are out there.
I guess the important point would be is that whether there was 3 levels or just 2, that's the whole purpose of organizing things into sort of an outline view, is that they should be consistent with each other no matter how many different summaries there were. Okay, and in the ethics, we have the 40 doctrines, which apparently was not originally divided into 40 different sections. And then, of course, we have the letter to Menorchius, which is devoted to ethics, and, of course, presumably in the 37 books on nature and other things, and many other works that Epicurus wrote. And then the canonics were represented in a book that the Epicureans called the Celestial Book or whatever, but that is lost. And so to the extent we know about that, we have to reconstruct his view on epistemology from the 40 doctrines, from the epistemological sections of Lucretius and the other texts that are available. Something that we haven't spent much time talking about in our podcast is Sextus Empiricus, who I think does also include discussion of Epicurean epistemology. And I can't believe I'm forgetting this one, the Philodemus work on signs, or on methods of inference. There's a De Lacy translation of On Methods of Inference, and then there's a good article by David Sedley in which he refers to that book as called On Signs. And so there's a lot of material out there. Canonics is probably the area that's been least examined in popular Epicurean writing and be most productive to pursue further as well, because it's a very deep subject of understanding what knowledge is possible and how you gain knowledge, and a lot of complicated questions in terms of the application of logic. There's the statement in Diogenes Laertius that Epicurus did not consider logic to be part of his canon of truth. That's a very deep statement to consider, and certainly he did use logic in certain ways, but there were limitations to it that he thought were important to talk about, and those are things that would bear a lot more examination, and we'll talk more about as we go through the podcast. One of the things that we read a lot in Norman DeWitt and other sources is Epicurus' relationship to Plato and even Aristotle and Pyrrho, the issues of skepticism. And DeWitt stresses several times through the book that one of the major thrusts of what Epicurus was doing was to examine the question of whether you can have confidence in knowledge or not, or whether you should be a radical skeptic like perhaps Pyrrho and other philosophers at that time were exploring. And he considered Plato and even to some extent Aristotle as being more skeptical in result than they needed to be, because they were not confident that sensation could lead to knowledge. They thought that you had to have an additional approach through a form of logic, the ideal forms that Plato discussed, or the essences that Aristotle pointed to. And that's a really significant point of Epicurean philosophy, is to trace how Epicurus rejected part or all of that analysis and attempted to ground confidence and knowledge on the senses themselves and the proper processing of the information from the senses. And that's ultimately what the epistemology of Epicurus is all about.
I'm curious what we think about this idea that the letter to Herodotus should be the first literature that was put into the hands of any potential Epicurean.
And not only then, but now. Of the letters, you read through Diogenes Laertius to look for the original, the letter to Herodotus is presented first. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it was intended to be presented that way to new students by Epicurus. So, Martin or Calasini?
Yes, I mean, actually, of those, what we have, it's the most difficult one. Actually, I started with this one, and it didn't put me off, but someone who has less stamina, who is just exploring and does not yet know much of it, might actually be put off by it. No?
That's a great general comment. Whether you're talking about Lucretius or any of this material, The person who doesn't have a general background in it can very easily get put off by the unfamiliarity of the material, by the way it's written. And that really describes my whole experience with Epicurean philosophy, especially through Lucretius. I attempted to read Lucretius several times over the course of 20 or more years, and I never made it very far because it's so different. And of course, Lucretius contains so many references that are very specific to the Roman time period. And all of these letters, all this material for a normal general reader is going to contain a lot of unfamiliar stuff that's very hard to process. That's why I generally suggest that somebody start with a commentary like Norman DeWitt to put everything in perspective. But yeah, the letter to Herodotus is the general examination of sort of the formation of the universe and the nature of atoms and void and how they come together, and then how bodies form from atoms and the properties of the atoms, which are eternal versus the changing aspects or appearances of bodies. And it's very deep material. It's not easy to just pick up and read from the very beginning. But nevertheless, to some extent, I would argue today that it probably is the most important and fundamental of the letters. And I wouldn't recommend anybody pick up any of the three without having read some background first. But I really do think that you're not going to get a good understanding of the letter to Menorchius, which everybody wants to read first, unless you understand where he's coming from in the letter to Herodotus and even to some extent in the letter to Epicurus.
Yeah, I agree with this one. So from the logical construction, it's more fundamental and preferably first. But like I said, it's a hard start.
It is a hard start. I mean, for example, when Epicurus talks about that death is nothing to us, people will go to the Tetrapharmacon and they'll reduce that down into don't fear the gods, as if it's sufficient to simply say don't fear the gods and move on to start talking about something else. But if you don't understand that the reason you don't fear the gods is that everything is natural and that there is no supernatural being, everything's ultimately made up of matter and void, to me, that totally colors why you don't fear death and why you don't fear the gods. Because somebody could say, well, I don't fear God because God is love and God loves me and God loves humanity. And that would be absolutely divergent from Epicurean philosophy. And you wouldn't even entertain such a position if you've first gone through the letter to Herodotus and the letter to Epicurus and you understand Epicurus' position about the way the universe works. Joshua, you raised that. I bet you've got some thoughts.
I think I was as guilty of anyone else as maybe skipping particularly the letter to Epicurus was something I didn't read until very late because, you hear about the letter to Menorchius as being sort of the most important letter. And so that's probably when I got to the point of reading his letters where I started. And maybe it would have been better if I'd started with the letter to Herodotus, but it's hard to say. I don't know.
Well, the way the world is, the truth, bitter or sweet, is that most people are going to go to the letter to Menorchius first. But nevertheless, for those people who are really serious about understanding Epicurean philosophy, as soon as you can, at least through a commentary, but as soon as you can, going through the letter to Herodotus and Epicurus will provide a foundation that really informs everything else.
Now, on this subject of the gods, there's another controversial point that's made in this text, and that is that Lucretius's poem presents a challenge to scholars. It appears to end horrifically, for one thing, but without much wrapping up, without much conclusion. There's no effort to put a bow on anything he's been writing up to that point. And so there's a number of theories. One of them is that he simply didn't have time to revise the poem before he died. And then perhaps the most extreme view is one that Norman DeWitt seems to share, which is that there's a whole seventh book either missing to us or simply never written, and that the subject of that lost seventh book was on the nature of the gods. And this was another practice, I gather, of the early Epicureans, which is that the gods are something that you come to later on in your study, almost even at the end, because if you just start out with them, you're bound to either be scared off from the philosophy because of impiety or atheism or whatever, or you're simply not going to understand the claims being made. But even if we look at a book like A Few Days in Athens by Frances Wright, it's funny because she waits until nearly the, middle of the book, even to begin to present Epicurus's position on various aspects of philosophy. For the first whole part of the book, Theon, the Corinthian, who's new to the garden, is completely ignorant about anything that's actually being taught there. Hasn't bothered to pick up a single book and read it. And so then at the very, very end of that book, you have this presentation of her interpretation of what Epicurus had to say about the gods. So maybe I just wonder, is that still the proper way to approach this, to take this issue of the gods as being something to be studied later? It would be included in the outline or the epitome early on, but then when you really get to filling out the details, that would be something to undertake later on in your study.
It depends on if you're coming to the question of the nature of the gods from a psychological view or from a more epistemological view of some kind of truth about the existence of the gods. But it seems to me you really do need to start with the nature of the gods first, because it just affects how you approach the whole thing. Why are you even studying the nature of the universe? If you believe in God, then the whole universe is just God, and you have a different kind of approach. Whereas if it's just humans on the earth and we're responsible for so much of everything, we're not relying upon God to take care of the earth, to take care of us, then suddenly it's really our responsibility to really understand the world and understand where we are. And so you really do need to start with understanding the nature of the God.
Martin?
Yeah, what we can get from all this, we have to start from somehow with everything. And that refers back to what we discussed before and what DeWitt already mentioned. So first you get a brief overview of everything, and then in steps you go to the details.
Yeah, I think that's what makes the most sense to me too. Joshua raised Lucretius. Both the beginning and the end of Lucretius are going to catch people by surprise. If they just pick up Lucretius and start reading, the first thing they're going to read is about how Venus and Mars are playing around in the sky somewhere and telling the birds and the bees how to go around and continue the procreation of the species. And you're going to have Lucretius asking Venus to calm Mars down so that the civil wars in the Roman period when he was living will calm enough so that he'll be able to write his poem. And then, of course, at the end, you have all this discussion of the plague of Athens, which is just death, death, death all around. And so if you just pick up one of those books without having been prepared for it, you're going to be very confused. And another example would be if you were to start with the letter to Menorchius, the very first thing that he talks about with the gods is that the reason you shouldn't fear them is not because they're only made of atoms and void or that they're natural, but the reason he gives in the letter to Menorchius, or the principal doctrines too, is that the gods aren't what we think of them. And his ultimate reasoning as to why they're not involved is not a physics argument, but a position that a God that is perfectly blissful and self-sufficient would not take any interest in punishing enemies or rewarding friends on some small planet like the Earth somewhere far away from where they live. So that's actually not an appeal to a physics argument as much as it is to an appeal to sort of, again, a logical type of argument that derives from the physics, but is not just directly physics. And of course, when you think about the letter to Menorchius or the other letters that he's written, you don't really know what these people that Epicurus was writing to already understood about Epicurean philosophy. Maybe he's talking to people who are very familiar with Epicurus. They've read some part, at least, of the 37 books or some other epitomes that are out there. And they understand the 12 elementary principles about how everything is made up of atoms and void. And so maybe they understood the physics, but maybe they didn't. And so it's important to get our perspective by its understanding from the very beginning whether these gods are supernatural and whether they're interfering in our lives or not. And maybe it's not quite so important at the very beginning to understand why they're not interfering. And certainly it's probably not important from the very beginning to start speculating about whether they speak Greek or how tall they are, or all these other details that do exist apparently in some of the Epicurean texts, but which would certainly be, I think from most anybody's perspective, little more than speculation and not very important at all for how you're going to actually live your life. So in analyzing what's important from the very beginning, what's not important from the very beginning, not only is the nature of the universe being natural and not supernatural important from the beginning, the nature of gods as being, again, part of the natural universe and not supernatural, there being no heaven and hell, death being the end of our existence, our consciousness. There's also the basic points about, in the end, what is the goal going to be? You don't want to leave people in suspense for too long. Once you've eliminated the idea of following God or the idea of working hard to get into heaven, once you've eliminated those as reasonable methods of organizing your life, you better tell people fairly quickly after that, well, then what is the right way to organize your life? And so in the principal doctrines, the letter to Menocius, there's a lot of initial discussion about the role of pleasure and pain, which are feelings, and the ultimate goal of there's words like calmness, tranquility, peace of mind, all sorts of other concepts that are going to be relevant to what it means to be happy. The whole issue of happiness, what that means, how pleasure relates to it, all of those things are touched on very quickly in the study of Epicurus so that you know where you're going and you're not left wondering and wandering about where to go. And so to some extent, what is going on here is that Epicurus is choosing to present to his students early in the process a series of firm statements. And he's going to suspend for the moment the idea of proving them or giving even the arguments behind them, other than maybe in a very, very general form. So to some extent, I guess you don't have very many choices. You can either just jump into some book that you don't understand and hope that you'll eventually find your way after reading page after page after page. Or you can listen to somebody like Epicurus himself or commentator who is going to give you a general summary of what it is you're about to read. And then, at least for the moment, you don't necessarily accept it or reject it, but you at least understand that this is the direction that you're going in. You don't just go from question to question to question without ever answering anything or presenting at the very beginning that map of the directions in which you're going.
It's interesting because this method of expressing dogmatic general statements as an overview of the philosophy is one that is taken by Stephen Greenblatt in The Swerve. There's really only one chapter in that book that is very good in giving us an overview of Epicurean philosophy, but the approach he takes is actually very similar to what we're going to see in DeWitt's book here.
It's been a while since I've read The Swerve, but I do agree with you that there's one very good chapter. The majority of the book is devoted to like the history of these church scholars who ended up preserving particular texts. But when he does deal with Epicurus in the middle of the book, there's a very good summary section about what it's all about. And I think this is where DeWitt returns to his warning again, that another reason that it's important to understand the general direction you're going in is because you do need to get an idea pretty quickly whether the people that you're reading from, whether the people you're listening to are generally supportive of Epicurus or whether they're generally attempting to undermine what he says. Because as DeWitt talks about, other than the text we have from Epicurus himself, other than Lucretius, Diogenes of Oinoander, much of the other material that we have about Epicurus is written by people who were hostile to Epicurus. And although they may have recorded information accurately, and in many cases we do think they did, the way they present it and what they present cannot be received uncritically without thinking about it. From Cicero on down through the Middle Ages. In fact, we discussed this last week, Joshua. I think you raised some of the translations of Lucretius, especially the ones that are in English. All you have to do is go through the introductions to those books written by these people in the 1700s and the 1800s. And they just fall all over themselves to distance themselves from the positions taken by Epicurus. As if I'm presenting this as my gift to scholarship in the world, but I want to make it clear that I don't believe a word of what he's saying about there being no life after death or pleasure being the ultimate end of life. Some of them will make attempts to justify some of it. I tend to think that, for example, Hugh Monroe is one of the major translators of Epicurus, who I think has an introduction in his translation, which I think is very supportive and praises the way that Epicurus and Lucretius approaches a lot of this material. But many of the others do not. Cyril Bailey strikes me as one who is not generally supportive of Epicurean ethics in particular. And just as we were talking about earlier in the episode, if you pick up Herodotus or Lucretius for the first time, it's very dense material that if you don't have a framework to understand it, you're not going to get into it very easily. And so these commentators are no better than us in that regard. They come at the subject with a viewpoint of their own, biases and prejudices, and even though they may be attempting to be as objective as they can, when you read some material, ancient Greek or Latin phrasing that's not familiar to you, you're doing your best, even when you're the most honest, to attempt to reconstruct it accurately. But if your version of the big picture of Epicurus is not consistent with where Epicurus was really going, it's very possible that your reconstruction, much less your commentary, is not going to be consistent with what Epicurus himself would have presented. From Thomas More's Utopia to Dante's Inferno, the different Jewish scholars who call heretics by the name of Epicurus, there's just almost an unending list of denunciations of Epicurus and Epicurean philosophy out there in Western literature for the last 2,000 years. And so even somebody trying to be as honest and objective as possible, when they come to a subject in that kind of a context where they know that it is disreputable to support what Epicurus is saying, it's not hard to believe that their conclusions and their opinions that they give you need to be scrutinized.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how differently things were, particularly Lucretius, how differently he was accepted by his peers, by Roman poets in the time that he was writing, poets and other writers. There was a much greater tendency to praise him and his ideas than what we find particularly throughout the Renaissance and the modern age. There's a real tendency to disavow everything in the poem, and we get that from Lucy Hutchinson was an early translator of the English text. Denis Lambin was a French translator and scholar and critic of the poem. I think probably the Daniel Brown version of 1743 has some repudiating words in the front of that. People who would attribute to the translator the ideas of the author of the poem, he says, are a precise fanatic in the Republic of Letters and the enemy of all serious learning. But if you look at the ancient world, the things were accepted much differently. And I just came across a quote by Vitruvius yesterday about Lucretius. I won't be able to quote it exactly, but he says that numberless people after our time will approach the writings of Lucretius as if they were speaking directly with him about nature. And it goes on to say that they'll have a conversation with Cicero about rhetoric, with Varro about the Latin language. And so he seemed to be able to get away with a lot more in classical antiquity, when these ideas would have been much more at home. And probably my favorite quote comes from Ovid, who says that the verses of sublime Lucretius will perish only when a single day shall consign the world to destruction. So it's a very different reception then from what it has been ever since then.
DeWitt points out that sometimes the French and the Italians are more sympathetic to Epicurean philosophy than the English. And of course, one of the major people who everybody credits with sort of reintroducing Epicurean studies into the West is Pierre Gassendi, the French philosopher.
Yeah, and Montaigne quotes Lucretius a lot and quite appreciatively. So I think you're right to say that in France in particular, there is much more acceptance of Epicurean thought than what you get in England.
As we begin to draw today's episode to a conclusion, next week when we come back, DeWitt begins a section on general true opinions versus false opinions about Epicurus. And so I think what we'll be doing next week is going through a very interesting list of general perceptions and labels that Epicurus tends to receive. And we'll talk about whether those are justified or not. Again, all with the purpose of allowing a reader of Epicurus who decides to pick up some Epicurean text to have some kind of a framework to understand those texts before he gets lost in the detail of the Roman gods or the particular level of physics in 300 BC Greece. So, Martin, any closing thoughts today?
I have no comment.
Calasini, any general thoughts for today?
Yeah. As this podcast was unfolding, I got this sort of vision of seeing an outline, which this could be done online, where you could see the whole overview of Epicureanism. And then under each one, by clicking on it, more detail pops up and you could go to greater and greater detail. So there's ways in which we could think about how to present the whole philosophy so that people can see the big picture and then kind of zoom into details. So as this podcast continues, I think we'll probably be using a lot of what comes up in our presentations to flesh out the outline. So this is all very interesting, and I'm happy to be here.
Very good. And you're certainly right about the idea of using internet technology to present some kind of an outline format. It's been several years since I made an effort to do that in a very primitive fashion. If somebody were to go to the website address, newepicurean.com/outline, I used the technology that was available to produce a clickable outline that you can, in fact, open and close according to the categories that you're looking to study. But it's a very primitive and unsatisfactory version. And so it'd be very good if we could work on more of an outline using the latest technologies. Okay, Joshua.
I wish I had more to add, but I'm kind of out of ideas at the moment.
Okay. Well, next week we'll come back and discuss true opinions and false opinions about Epicurus and, again, put things in a wider perspective. And so until then, let's bring today's episode to a close, and we'll come back next week. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you then. Bye.
Very good.
Bye.